started. Welcome everybody here in the room and people online for joining us today again for Hot Politics Live session. So last week we had a sociologist, so quickly running back to political science. And today our speaker is Frank Gonzalez. Frank, it's for you 6 in the morning or something?
7.
7 in the morning. So good morning to you. We're almost ready to have a drink. I guess you're almost ready.
I'm already there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to show you the martini next to me.
yeah. Cleverly disguised in a coffee cup. Frank is an assistant professor. He's at the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. And the very interesting aspect of his work is he's really one of the few people in political science who really tries to look at the brain, the actual brain. And so he has published several pieces using fMRI or also EEG or just
never.
Yeah. Trying to connect that with a range of interesting questions in political science, concerning ideology, for example. Also see here a research line on disease salience, how these influence policy attitudes. So this is really interesting stuff, and it's published all across political science, but also more the neuroscience direction. So really happy to have you, Frank, here. Hoping also to meet you in the future for real, because we've never had the opportunity. So for those of you new here today, Frank will present for 20-25 minutes. Then we'll have a Q&A, and also the people online can ask questions. They can ask their questions through the Q&A function below your screen, and we'll read out the question for you in the room. And that's it. Yeah, Frank, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Gish. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me. I've known you guys, without meeting actually, for a while, and I've known Bert for a long time. So I've always kept up with Hot Politics Lab, and so really excited to be presenting to you guys. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Oh, no, that's not what I want to do. Share. There we go. You see my presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. So the title of this project is Inhibition or Ideology, the Neuromechanisms of Racial Priming in Politics. And I'm Frank Gonzalez. I've also been working on this particular paper with Ingrid Haas, who was on my dissertation committee, and is really the only reason that I know anything about MRI at all. And even then, I think it's safe to say that anybody that does political neuroscience has a particular. Oh, this is. I'm sorry. I have the version of an old. This is prepared for you guys, not for this thing down below here. So sorry, I changed that, but this must be the past version of this PowerPoint. I hope that doesn't change anything. But anyway, Ingrid and I have been working on this for a while, and I'll start, talk about that, but it also leads into this broader research agenda I've been pursuing about the neural mechanisms of not just how people process race, but how race influences people's political evaluations, and really what's going on there. So I'm kind of going to go a little bit all over the map in terms of the literatures I'm going to address here. And that's on purpose. I think that it's really important to take a broad view of this if we're talking about like what prejudice is and where we think it comes from, and especially when it influences political attitudes. And I'll talk more about how I think we need to kind of deconstruct how we think about the connection between race and politics a little bit as I go. But let's start with just some folk wisdom about prejudice and the idea of being biased against a certain group of people just because of who they are. William Hazlitt, as you all know, the English essayist, just kidding, I think I found the quote and then Googled the author afterward. But that's prejudice is the child of ignorance. So there's this idea, and this largely comes out of in some sense, Enlightenment thinking, which is this idea that we're not going to be prejudiced against other groups for irrational reasons, right? We have this high valuation of rationality in humans, and it makes us feel special as a species compared to other animals, to feel like we have reason, the capacity for reason other animals don't. And just hating another group because of some arbitrary identity doesn't seem to fit with that. So there's this idea that there's a deficit, cognitive deficit even, that leads to prejudice. And Voltaire, even before William Hazlitt, said prejudices are what fools use for reason. And then we can even go up to more present day, and Michael Jackson saying prejudice. I don't think Michael Jackson jokes are really they're frowned upon these days. But prejudice is ignorant, right? So we just have this idea that being prejudiced is stupid. That's why you shouldn't do it, because it doesn't make any rational sense. Right. And so this is what I sort of consider the deficit model, cognitive deficit model of prejudice, where there's something, if you were to use reason and logic, then you would sort of overcome these arbitrary biases that you have. And this is reflected in Enlightenment thought. It also, which obviously Enlightenment thought, the Enlightenment is a huge motivation behind revolution, like the American Revolution and French Revolution, and Western civilization. This idea that there is some reason or higher capacity for logic and rationality that not only just humans have, but it's particularly captured in Western civilization. And so this is ironically enough often captured in justifications for racism that we've seen in the past historically. So this is a cartoon from a long time ago. The white man's burden, right? And so you have this idea that, Uncle Sam, and what is that guy, British or Dutch? I don't know. But the Western European civilized cultures are carrying the savage, uncivilized cultures to civilization, and they're overcoming barbarism, oppression, ignorance, superstition, vice, all these things that we consider irrational and therefore not human in a sense, right? It is, I don't know, I have a whole thing that I often go to that I'll resist about, how important we think it is to feel special as humans, right? And so our idea that our culture, our civilization gives us this is key. Obviously, so I study predominantly in the context of American politics, and this is huge in terms of the mythology that we surround ourselves with. The America as the shining beacon on the hill, where we are the cradle of the epitome. You guys know this as, about that America is the shining beacon on the. No, that we believe this here. And diversity, to some degree, obviously a long history of racism, but you still have this idea that diversity is like we're the melting pot, and this is overcoming prejudices in some way. This is reflected, right, in sorry, I'm trying to make sure I have some timing. I don't know if Giz, you're able to give me a notification at markers in time, just because I tend to.
What kind of notifications would you like to have? Like halfway or?
Yeah, halfway.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. The race priming literature in political psychology and American politics is parallel to this in a lot of ways. Right. So we have this literature that's built largely in the 90s and early 2000s. Tally Mendelberg writes The Race Card, a seminal book, and people like Nick Valentino and others build on this research and show that, so the Willie Horton ad in the early 90s was this infamous ad that was supposedly priming race implicitly. So when people prime race, when political campaigns want to stoke fears and prejudice in whites in America, the idea is that they have to do so implicitly. It used to not be the case that they had to do so implicitly, but as the norm of egalitarianism and the idea that racism is bad has become strengthened, they have to do that increasingly. This isn't irrelevant these days. Obviously, we have a lot of talk about dog whistles and race priming in contemporary American politics. This was one of many examples used during the Trump campaign of, it's never mentioning exactly Mexicans are bad or anything like that, but it says illegal immigrant, Luis Brasamontes killed our people, and all this stuff about like loving killing cops and stuff like that. So, right, so this is a very established literature in American politics and political psychology. You have the work by Kinder, Sears, Sanders, P.J. Henry talking about symbolic racism, this idea that racism has evolved to the new racism is expressed in terms of individualism and these subtle ways, right? These vehicles. Oh, sorry, you see the absurd painting. We have a lot of absurd paintings in my house. Oh, maybe you didn't see it. You have this evolution of what racism is. Snyderman and Carmine say it's really about principles, right? And these sort of values that have evolved rather than racial animus. Marty Gillen talks about how race has subtly come to sort of contaminate our attitudes towards welfare. All this work by Sedanius and Prado, and then Mendelberg's work on race priming, right? So it's subtle, right? Well, then things seem to become less subtle in American politics. And you have, a lot of people talking about Donald Trump and Trumpism more broadly, and this rise in American politics in what seems to be overt racism. Donald Trump, a lot of tweets about that seem to, maybe there's still a veil of there hiding it, but it's a thin veil. It's a very thin veil. And it's channeling these very obvious calls to racial threats that are easily decoded by the American public. He started, but arguably this goes before Trump was president, right? He started the birther movement, and you have even these Romney supporters. Before it was the big bad Trump White House, Romney supporters still were being accused of racism a lot. And there's this paper relatively recently by Nick Valentino and Fabian Neuner and Vandenbrooks that says that the standard racial priming model suggests overt expressions of racial hostility are unacceptable to the vast majority of Americans. They actually find nothing of the sort. They can't replicate these older findings. They find that racial animus measured in different ways is just a powerful force, regardless of whether it's primed implicitly or explicitly. So is there something changing here? So the questions we're looking at really are, so what's changing? Is something different? And is that manifested in biology or neurobiology? So what are the neural and biological mechanisms of explicit versus implicit race priming? When are political evaluations most likely to be racist? I used to kind of dodge this like a lot of psychologists do, saying like racially biased or prejudiced, but like I wanted to find this a little bit broadly on purpose because it could be anti-Black bias, but it could also just be the colorblind principles, which is a little bit of what, we've sort of evolved from the principles versus prejudice literature of the 90s to say that, to more acknowledge in contemporary literature that like ignoring race can also be racist if it supports a racially unequal status quo, right? And then do these neural consequences of explicit versus implicit racial priming differ based on political leaning? I'll explain more why I'm looking at that in a second. But just to kind of, briefly sum up, the traditional race priming model is that racial biases most likely influence political evaluations. When racial cues are subtle, covert, and implicit, when race is explicit, individuals can inhibit these biases because they're abiding by egalitarian norms. So it puts race on the radar and lets people think about it more. Supposedly, there is reference to the psychology, the psychological mechanisms behind this in this literature. Implicit cues to trigger automatic processing. And so the influence of racial prejudice is less controllable when the cue is implicit. When it's explicit, it should trigger controlled processing and deliberation. People identify the bias and they inhibit it. They can tailor their evaluations to be in line with the principles of equality as, good, rational, unbigoted humans. There's neuroscience research on how people process race. So I'll show you sort of like what we're looking at in the brain. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thanks, Gish. So the cortical limbic system. Okay. So essentially what we're going to be looking at here is the amygdala is essentially where we would expect to see the automatic evaluation, detecting emotional relevance of this attitude object. And then we should see things go through the anterior cingulate where you're looking at more error detection and the identifying that there's a conflict between your motivation and what your automatic reaction was. And then the prefrontal cortex or DLPFC is where we should see executive function coming in to change the evaluation. The hippocampus is also relevant here, supposedly, but I won't talk about that. But I think it's really interesting for future work. And yeah, Gish, if you don't mind, if when I just have like 2 minutes left, just tell me that too. I really want to make sure we maximize the Q&A. So I won't go over this for the sake of time too much, but there are some social neuroscience models of attitude about how attitudes form that influence the models of how humans process race in the brain. The iterative reprocessing model is one that I rely on a lot by Will Cunningham and colleagues. And it's this idea that your attitudes exist on a spectrum from more influenced by automatic processes to more influenced by controlled processes. And there's this iterative process between these parts of the brain that shapes your evaluation over time. And so literally when you see an attitude object, your evaluation of it changes over the course of milliseconds to seconds to tens of seconds as you iteratively go back and forth between automatic and controlled processes. And what they show, this is an older study, and I actually talked to Will Cunningham about this before, and he said they were using like a what do you call that? A projector kind of sorts to show these images. It's very old school. But they showed black versus white faces for 30 milliseconds and then 525 milliseconds, which should be a little bit below the threshold of conscious awareness versus in-conscious awareness. And they showed that the amygdala reacted more when to black faces when they were shown implicitly or subconsciously in this case. And then the amygdala was reduced and you saw frontal cortex activation when it was conscious. This is just, I'm not going to go through this table too much, but I'm going to show a similar table to get you used to sort of how we look at MRI results other than those cool pictures, which I will show. But this is a little bit different than what I'm going to look at. And what we're going to look at is when race is relevant explicitly versus not, rather than looking at black versus white faces. We also have some quandaries here, which is that in politics, right, it's not necessarily about subliminal faces being shown versus not. It's about whether race is explicitly or implicitly relevant. And for example, like we know that when race is explicitly relevant, and this has been the case for decades, like affirmative action or race-targeted scholarships or race and policing, prejudice has a significant influence. It's not like people are inhibiting their biases toward relative to racial prejudice when something's explicit necessarily. There's also some work, Huber and Lipinski showed, for example, that the traditional model might only hold for some people. It's maybe limited to highly educated individuals in their study. And of course, this more recent work I mentioned saying maybe it changes over time. That's inherently part of the Mendelberg framework, is that norms change over time. But is that what's happening here, or is there just differences across people in terms of who's affected and how? And right, so where I'm kind of going with this is the traditional work in social psychology that motivations matter. Whether you're motivated to inhibit that bias is going to be relevant. So we say explicit race prime should induce controlled processing about race, but whether this leads to more or less bias should depend on ideological motivations. Behaviorally, what this means is that pro-white racial bias should be stronger when race is implicit, but this should be mainly the case for liberals rather than conservatives. But neurally, perhaps more importantly, implicit racial prime should trigger automatic processing, which should be in the amygdala and insula, kind of. You'll see. Regardless of ideology, explicit racial primes should trigger control processing in the ACC and PFC, regardless of ideology. But when you have controlled processing and the ACC and PFC are activated, this should be associated with reduced pro-white racial bias amongst liberals, but more in conservatives because of their motivations regarding race run in opposite directions. This is the disappointing part, where you see the data I'm going to show you today is only 27 white adults from the Tucson community. But I'll just preview, we're in the process of still collecting data on 40 more people with a slightly different design here. And we have a lot of within subject variation here. So right there, it's I won't go through the demographics here, but we can come back to it for the sake of time. The experimental design is that it's a 2x2. So the race of the applicant, and you'll see what that means, is black or white, and it was either explicit or implicit, the racial prime. They're asked how much they oppose or support monetary aid from the government going to an individual after a random fact, which should be totally unrelated to evaluations, is shown to them, like they have an Audi belly button, or they like ice cream in a cone rather than a cup, weird things like that. And participants were, as you might expect, like, why am I evaluating this? And that's kind of the point. So the picture of the applicant, though, was either shown for 1,000 milliseconds, which is scientific for 1 second, or 30 milliseconds. So we're really in the world of like the psychology version of implicit versus explicit here, more so than American politics. I'll just preview it to say that in this new study, it's much more the traditional political science implicit versus explicit, where race is subtly part of their evaluation versus explicitly, not with just 30 milliseconds versus 1,000 milliseconds or anything like that. But here in this study, so the explicit trials look like this. You see a face for a second, and then they're always making nicknames for people. Do you want to give them monetary aid? And then the implicit trials, where it's only 30 milliseconds, where it should be below the level of conscious awareness. And you have a noise mask before and after that hides that image. We used event-related design, 4 blocks of 40 trials in each block. So we have a lot of data per person. We used faces from the Chicago Face database. Everything is randomized. I can come back to this sort of stuff after for the Q&A if you like. I definitely am going to just come back to this because you might be interested in the TR we used and NP rage images, but I just have this here for Q&A more or less, like the MRI settings. And we just use a 5-point self-report scale for ideology. I will say, though, that we have other measures that should tap these motivations as well that we've looked at a little bit, but not totally. And the behavioral analyses, we're just going to look, I know it's only 25 people, but that's 3,600 trials, but still a lot of, if there's between person variation, this should matter. And we're going to look at essentially a model where the main important thing is this bolded interaction, applicant race versus implicit or explicit versus ideology, which again, here in this sample, the ideology part is going to be, even though it's a big part of our theory, is going to be hard to test persuasively in such a small sample because that is a between subjects factor. But in the MRI analysis, what we can look at is what their brain is doing for implicit versus explicit trials. We can look at this separately for liberals and conservatives. And we do have a lot of within-person data here. And importantly, to make this testable in terms of the traditional framework, I'm going to create a variable that's called conscious race bias inhibition, or CRBI, which is the degree to which participants were more racially biased in non-conscious rather than conscious trials, or implicit rather than explicit trials, because what we want to see is whether people who were inhibiting their bias in conscious trials did actually have parts of their brain associated with inhibition lighting up. And is this the case for liberals and for conservatives? We use an MRI analysis called FLAME mixed effects model. It's all uncorrected for now just because of the sample size, and there are between person factors here, but there are corrections that we can implement down the road. In the behavioral analysis, we didn't find that implicit or explicit mattered actually significantly, which isn't terribly totally different than, it's different, but it's not the same test that, Mendelberg and Valentino and others were doing. This is 30 milliseconds versus 1,000 milliseconds race prime. And here, so we don't see that mattering behaviorally on average, on the aggregate. But we do see liberals favor Black applicants. Moderates also tend to favor Black applicants, and conservatives favored white applicants on average. It's not a huge difference, but it's there on the aggregate. Here's that awesome table, but I'll highlight what's relevant. So we actually didn't find, so when we're, forget CRBI or ideology for now, if we just look at explicit versus implicit, we didn't find that the amygdala or insula were really associated with implicit trials. There's some VOC clusters here. So cluster size is the number of voxels that lit up. And then the peak activation is kind of the strength. And it tells you here like what parts of the brain are really, it's picking up on. Not really much here. It's significant, but I don't know how much I would bet money on that replicating. But where we did see activation was really in the ACC and PFC. Though that hypothesis was supported when race was explicitly primed and it was a conscious evaluation, we have a pretty big cluster of activation in the ACC, also the OFC, which is the orbital frontal cortex, and the DLPFC, which is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Really a big cluster of activation here. We also, though, seem to have parts of the insula. The insula is actually more responding to conscious rather than unconscious prime. So the insula almost, we didn't want to, change our expectations post hoc, but there is some literature that suggests this could make sense. That actually maybe we should have been looking at the insula as a error detection and conflict detection part of the brain. So it's more active during explicit trials here. And if you want to look at it in the brain, the picture, this is the DLPFC response, for example. And you see these clusters of activation responding when people are explicitly primed with race. Okay, let's look at CRBI. And what you have here.
All right, I didn't hear you. Oh, 2 more minutes.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
So what we have here, if you look at what parts of the brain were associated with explicit, with high CRBI people when they were looking at explicit primes, what you find is that, and lower levels of bias in conscious primes, essentially, is what we're looking at here, or explicit primes. You have insula again, and you also have ACC and OFC. DLPFC isn't really doing much. That's, maybe in the early days of MRI, you could publish on that, but probably not even one voxel. But right, so this is partial support for our expectation that higher order levels of the brain are leading people to actually inhibit their racial bias in the explicit primes. It's really ACC, though, this error detection part of the brain, rather than the DLPFC or OFC. What if we just look at liberals, though? We see partial support for our hypothesis about ideology here, where the insula, ACC, OFC, and DLPFC all show some level of, and you can see DLPFC, you can sort of preview that there's 4 voxels here, but it's almost more in the other direction, actually. But OFC and ACC are for sure activated for liberals when they're looking at explicit trials, especially on people who actually inhibited their bias in explicit trials. But we do have these other unexpected clusters. This is the nice thing about MRI work, is that you don't just, it's not just one or the other. There can be some clusters in the ACC or OFC that are associated supporting your hypotheses, and other clusters in that same part of the brain that actually go against your hypotheses. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing about MRI, but it's a thing. And there are some parts of the brain that are associated with an increased likelihood of being biased in the conscious trials. Here are the pictures of that, if you're interested. But this is the cluster that I just showed you that's actually in the DLPFC associated with increased likelihood of anti-Black racial biases. I should note that this usually doesn't actually mean being anti-Black in your evaluations, it just means being less pro-Black, because liberals tended to be heavily pro-Black in their evaluations. But conservatives, there's just less going on here. In sort of support for our hypotheses, like, you actually do have areas of the insula, ACC, I'm sorry, insula is a middle ground, but ACC, OFC, and DLPFC, I'm sorry, ACC and OFC, not DLPFC, that are associated with increased bias. Increased bias in explicit trials. And you don't really have much. You have 7 voxels and 4 voxels that are associated with decreased bias. But if anything, there's more going on in the ACC and OFC that's associated with increased bias. And there's just nothing differentiating conservatives in the DLPFC. So, and if you want to look at the ACC, though, here are those clusters. So, to sum up, liberals tended to exhibit pro-Black evaluations. Conservatives tended to exhibit pro-white evaluations if we just look at the aggregate. We don't have any support for this idea that at least the amygdala, and certainly not the insula, is reacting to implicit racial primes. But we have evidence that the PFC and ACC are actually reacting to explicit racial primes, supporting hypothesis 3. And the insula seems to maybe be in there as well, actually. And we have explicit, so the reactions to the explicit primes associated with PFC and ACC activation are indeed associated with decreased pro-white biases amongst liberals mainly. But there's essentially no difference, or potential, in some cases, even a slight increase in pro-white racial bias amongst conservatives. So I call this partial support for hypothesis 4. But as you can see, it's more complicated because there are clusters of activation kind of going in each direction. It's just where more of them are. So the neural foundations are actually, to me, surprisingly, I'm always surprised when we actually see, this is quite far in terms of what the participants are actually doing from what like Mendelberg and Valentino were actually studying. But we still see that, consistent with these theorized mechanisms, controlled processing really does seem to be more what's happening when people are explicitly exposed to race in their political evaluations, but these processes are not invariant. Motivations matter. That's what I take away from this. Here it's ideology, but we've also looked a little bit at motivation to respond without prejudice, which I also had in the post-scan survey, and we have a bunch of other stuff as well in there. Political motivations define the consequences of controlled processing. And so what this means is that, we really need to, when we talk about race, there's a lot of people that acknowledge now that you don't want to just hide it, because this can actually lead people to exacerbate their biases because they don't have that controlled processing to inhibit their bias. But we also probably need to not just make it explicit. You need to work on motivations, which, as you all know, is extremely easy to do. Just kidding. Limitations, right? So 27 participants, but I do have 2 much larger MTurk samples that we've done very similar things on. I'm happy to talk about on our online sample data. The figures for that are still very ugly, and you guys always make such nice figures in your papers, so I was like, I'm not showing them. But I could in the Q&A if you really want. And study 2, we're still collecting data. It's gone slow because of COVID, but we're hoping to get 40 participants that are way more balanced in terms of ideology, and really kind of look more directly at the role of social norms. This is assumed to be the explanation in the racial priming literature. So, but there's norms about whether to be racist, and there's norms about what counts as racism, right? And so this might be what differs across ideology. So there's a lot of people to thank here. But thank you guys.
Thanks a lot, Frank. Great presentation. Very exciting stuff. Let's quickly go to the Q&A. And again, if you are online, you can type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll monitor that. I'm gazing towards the room there. Immediate question here. Yes, Tobias.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. I was wondering, like, on what level of generalization we are here when you talk about the theoretical mechanism. So I'm more interested in sexism, and I was just kind of at one point catching myself mentally replacing racial cues with gender cues and racism with sexism. And the story still seems to work, at least on a theoretical level. So are you talking about like kind of these general mechanisms of cognitive processing, or is it a specific story about race?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. I think theoretically, we shouldn't have. There's certainly no obvious reason, given the existing theory, to say that this should be limited to race, but I think there's plenty of really interesting possibilities in terms of how this might differ. And it's funny because I've thought about gender a lot, and I've sort of defined myself around race. So I may have to wait till this might be like a post-tenure thing to switch a little bit. But I do really think that gender is really pivotal in these political messages that we've seen these days. More so, I know a lot of people talk about gender, but I think it's still even totally underrated in terms of how important gender primes are in American political campaigns and just political campaigns broadly. And the question to me is really like, are they implicit or there might be some work on this, so I apologize if I'm just sort of like ignoring some work on this, but like, how much does even the traditional race priming literature apply when it comes to gender? And gender also, racism comes in various forms, but gender particularly, you can have hostile sexism, you have benevolent sexism, you have a lot of different ways to prime gender attitudes beyond just sort of like, hey, this group is threatening. In fact, a lot of the time it's not with gender, it's not that this group is threatening necessarily, unless you're trying to prime hostile sexism, which is common, right? That women are trying to control men and take power for the sake of power. But you might also be priming benevolent sexism, right? This idea that we need to, take care of women, and they have this inherent moral superior quality, or chaste, pure quality. Long story short, I think there's a lot of potential avenues for really interesting differences here. I still think the overall theory here is that engaging the controlled processing, at least at the neural level, is it's not, and this isn't what Mendelberg says or the traditional race priming literature says. So I don't want to make it like this is a straw man argument here. But it's not this rationality. It's not that people are like using their intellect to like overcome misconceptions and they're smarter. It's adhering to norms. What it's getting people to do is say, oh, shoot, the norm tells me to do this, and I'm going to do that instead now. So if the norms around being not sexist are really strong in your environment or your social circles, I would expect that these same, that control processing would lead you to be like, oh, shoot, don't be a paternal sexist, if you're somebody who's aware of that. But if you're not, and we still have very lax norms around gender in so many ways in our society, then it might not. So that I would still expect the same process in that respect.
Thanks, Frank. There's a question here from Summit.
Yes. Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. And I was wondering whether you've thought about or you have what your ideas are about which motivations these are that are going on in people's minds.
Yeah, so I think that's a really open question. It's still an open question for me, certainly. And there's certainly at least a few really highly probable ones. So I look at ideology here, and I think my original thinking was that, it's political mode. It's like, so, people develop principles about their political ideology. They develop these principles, right? So to reference sort of the Snyderman and Carmine's side of the principles or prejudice debate. It's not necessarily that people are, so when it goes from implicit to explicit, people go from like sort of, animus toward this racial group to some principle, some ideological principle about how the world should work. That's less about just not liking a group, but it still could be racist, right? I mean, it's then colorblind racism or principled laissez-faire racism or whatever else you want to call it, where they support the status quo and therefore just sort of tolerate inequality. And so the idea here would be like there's some motivation to have ideological principles, and what those principles are is what's pulling people. The other side of it, I think that I've come to a little bit more so, is that it's really about the norm itself. So like I have some work with David Wilson and Darren Davis on political correctness, and it's what's sort of obvious in politics in America and in various parts of Europe is that part of this, populist wave is like anti-political correctness, right? So this idea that like we're sick of the elites telling us the politically correct way to think and talk and act. And so it's an attack on the norm itself, which is really kind of meta in a way, I guess. But, this could be the motivation, which is the motivation isn't necessarily about the political ideology, which is what I looked at here, but it's about attitudes toward the norm of egalitarianism. So yeah, I think those are two really interesting potential avenues, but there could be others as well.
Thanks, Frank. There's a question here online by Luca Verstegen. The first question is, based on your findings, do you agree with Hazlitt's statement that prejudice is the child of ignorance? That is prejudice just a question of awareness and motivation?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yes, I can see the question as well. That's a great question. I kind of go back and forth. I think I've kind of sold this traditionally as saying that it's against that idea, that it's not just sort of like a rational calculus that controlled processing engages that leads people to inhibit their biases. But on the other hand, I guess it depends on how you define ignorance. Right. So although it certainly doesn't seem to be that, those who are inhibiting their biases, who in this case I operationalize as liberals, are certainly more in tune with the social norm. And if you're a nihilist like me, then you kind of see like that's really all there could be is, the norm of egalitarianism. And, people are either motivated to tailor their evaluations and behaviors in line with that or not. And it's interesting, so I'm still kind of, even though like, despite like what I conclude from these data, like I'm still on the fence in terms of what I'll see when I have a more diverse sample, in terms of are, conservatives in this case, actually is controlled processing really leading them to double down on racial biases, or at least racial biases in their politics? Or is it sort of just like those, even the parts of the brain that were active there was still just much less activation. And, you have this other work on like structural differences across ideology. And, Gish and I were talking about this, the amygdala, but also the ACC. Did that not replicate, Gish, in your? Oh, interesting. I was really kind of banking on that, but
sorry,
it's more complicated. But there seems to be some structural differences, and so I don't write off the deficit model completely. It's just, I don't mean that in a negative way necessarily. It's just like, is it more or less of this motivation or an ability to tailor actions in line with norms, or is it just differences in how you use that equal ability? I still don't really know. Oh, and the other question was the MTurk one. Yeah. So I didn't do the exact same thing. That would be too messy to try and 30 milliseconds versus a full second racial primes on an online sample. But it's in line with this. It's still the idea. So we're looking at implicit versus explicit in terms of like, so people evaluated which neighborhood of two that they would want to give government assistance to. And I manipulated whether I explicitly tell them that the neighborhood is this percentage African-American, or I just told them like the name of the mayor, and the mayor has a stereotypically African-American or stereotypically white name. And also some other things like what the favorite music is. And it's either like rap or something more stereotypically white, and a couple things like that. And really the most robust finding is, you see that liberals consistently, are pro-Black in their evaluations compared to conservatives, but you do have a lot of variation. Picking up on actual pro-white bias amongst conservatives kind of depends on the context. Most conservatives in more political contexts are just sort of like, they're just neutral, which in some ways is sort of like, oh, they're not biased. But in other ways, it's sort of like, oh, they just don't think that race should be a factor in who gets assistance, right? So that fits with like the colorblind racism argument. And so, yeah, there's really not much in terms of the mechanisms in the MTurk data, except to just reinforce the behavioral side that these things do. Oh yeah, and they differ across liberals and conservatives, right? The role of explicit versus implicit. So you do see that explicit primes are really inhibiting, leading to behavior inhibition for liberals in these larger samples as well. I hope that's.
Thanks. I had a question of clarification mostly about the brain data you show. You show these tables where it says 40% of this, 30% of that. Is that sort of a network activation, or I wasn't sure what that's.
Yeah, sure. Good question. So
maybe you can pull up the
bring that up. And so, okay, so in this, here, I'll show you just the, just so it's easier to interpret. This is just explicit versus implicit blocks. And so we did region of interest analyses. So we predefined, right, which parts of the brain we were going to look at. And then within those regions, essentially what FSL, the software we're using, is doing is, so these are the contrasts, right? Non-conscious. So these are, so it's identifying the voxels, clusters of voxels, or in some cases voxel, in this area of the brain where activation was statistically significant, right? So in terms of the Z-score relative to the other condition. And so parts of the brain that were more active in the implicit or non-conscious trials compared to the conscious trials, there's 11 voxels. And these voxels are actually 30% in the insula, but there is 14% of those voxels that touch into the OFC. So it's sort of like there's well, I guess no, the 11 voxels are just insula. but there's a region of activation that is 30% insula and 14% OFC. I don't really know beyond that much, like how exactly.
There seems to be percentages missing.
Yeah, like how that percentage is actually calculated. Is it relative to how I've been taught to interpret it is, and this is priming my political neuroscience imposter syndrome for sure, but is the region of activation itself is 30% insula and 14% OFC. And this is 88% insula, this region of activation. So that matters, right? This is 28% OFC, 21%. So then if there's actually, when you get the full results, for example, you'll get a bunch of smaller percentages and other things too. So that you're right, that's why this doesn't add up to 100. But these are the largest.
Good. Hey, Bert has a question.
Hi Frank, how are you doing?
I'm
not going to ask you difficult questions about calculations. I'm going to ask you, but how I understood this experiment was pretty clear out-group or in-group, right? But is there some variation in the degree of out-groupiness these people were? And if so, do you expect that there's some sort of tipping point, or is this a gradual change? Like the more you come to look different like me, and does that matter if it's implicit or explicit? Like,
well, yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, this sort of idea of like considering this on a spectrum, out-groupiness is I don't know of any work that addresses that, but it's certainly addressed often in political social psychology and race literature, right? The idea here is that what you're in, at least in the political science literature traditionally, is that you're not priming specific individuals, you're priming a prototype. You're priming the prototypical, stereotypical Black male or Latino immigrant. And so, that kind of dodges that a little bit. But when you're actually looking at the specifics of who's being primed, I mean, the Willie Horton ad is famous because Willie Horton was chosen, presumably because of how stereotypical he was in all these different domains. But we know that there's lots of literature, right, on how people categorize race, and where people actually consider based on skin tone, but also all sorts of other traits, whether somebody's Black or not, whether somebody's white or not. But the one thing I do want to say is, like, I'm not sure this is an in-group versus out-group thing. That's an empirical question in this case because I only look at white participants. But there's also another force here, which is, just negative stereotypes about minoritized groups. And so we might expect to see the same thing amongst African-American participants.
And
do
you have any variation in these primes in terms of skin tone or?
So actually, I see. There's actually a really interesting test I could do here. I have all the so the Chicago Face Database codes every face on like 20 different dimensions, including stereotypicalness, nose to mouth ratio, skin tone, all these sorts of things. So
that you could correlate, right? Like if there's some variation in your stimuli, that it should amplify or hamper these effects, right? To some extent.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Although, I mean, that's an interesting question because, especially for the implicit ones. I don't know if your brain picks up on.
Maybe not, right? Maybe that only comes when you start staring at the face for a little longer.
Yeah, and then it's sort of that'd be really interesting. Okay, I can do that. Thanks, Bert.
There's a comment from participant
hey,
list.
Ingrid. Oh, okay. Ingrid's here. She will know the answer to the percentages thing.
Oh, so this refers, I think, came from
the probabilistic atlases. We usually use an FSL, reflection of the fact that localization in the brain is not exact average across trials and runs and across people. So it's most similar to the likelihood probability that activation is occurring in that area in terms of how to interpret. Thank you, Ingrid, for saving me. Ingrid is it's also saving that she taught me anything I know about MRI. So if I say something wrong, then it's her fault mainly. No, just kidding.
Okay, great. We're coming almost to the end. Okay, are you there, Frank?
I'm there. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. There was something wrong in the room for a second. Okay. Yeah. Well, it's better than last week. Then every Zoom was blocked for all of us.
Oh, Martin.
Thanks to the IT department. I guess we should thank them as our sponsors. I wanted to ask you one more question, or is there actually another question?
Yeah.
That's just Martin Roosema. Hi, Martin. Thanks for. I wanted to ask you one more question. You have to give a short answer. Political neuroscience is, of course, quite a niche. There are not a lot of people working in that area. And I'm staring here at the room, lots of PhD students, postdocs, other students. And so I think there were a couple of sort of quite blank stares at the fMRI data.
Yeah.
I'm not offending anyone, but what can you recommend these people to read to convince them that political neuroscience is a niche?
Yeah, no, this is thanks for asking that, because it's sort of like one of those hills I've decided that is worth maybe not dying on, but getting severely wounded on, because it's one of those things where it's like, this has been controversial in political science, whether it's really of interest to us, and whether it should be interest of us. And I've presented this before and had people, more brazenly sort of say like, why do we care? And so there's two sides of this. One is that, there is, and, not to go back too much to so Krosnick's distinction, right, between political psychology and psychological political science. And what are the questions that we're asking, and what theories do they advance? What forms of knowledge do they advance? And there is such thing as research done to advance our knowledge of human behavior in the political domain. And so understanding the brain, and so part of this is certainly understanding the brain and understanding human behavior more broadly in the domain of politics. And I think that certainly has a lot of value. And if you present to a room full of neuroscientists or social psychologists, they're like, yeah, that's why I do what I do. But that's not the main argument that I usually make. The main argument I usually make is that this is actually incredibly valuable for political psychology, or whatever one fits with Krosnick's distinction, directly. It tells us about politics, political questions that, at least political psychology questions, that we wouldn't be able to answer without brain data, or at least reliably. It's not just that the brain gives us a more direct look at the proposed mechanisms. That's certainly part of it. Like other work, that might try to look at this would use like some sort of cognitive task, or, people use like implicit measures or IATs and things like that. And that's all fine and good. But you get a little bit more of a direct look with MRI research. But the other thing is, when you actually look, you can never, at other sorts of behavioral data, you rarely can actually determine, are these different mechanisms happening for different people, or is the same mechanism leading to different outcomes for different people? How much variation is there in terms of the actual neurobiology of people and the functions of the brain of people with widely varying political views. And it tells you about, this is a little bit sort of what others have used as a defense of, why this is important for political science is the neurobiological constraints on political decision-making and evaluations. The more we learn about like how the brain actually works when people are doing this thing related to politics or thinking about this thing related to politics, the more we know what is possible and what's not possible. I don't want to say possible or not possible necessarily, because there's a lot of room for plasticity in the brain, and the brain is capable of very extraordinary things. But what's likely and not likely is certainly really evident in the brain. That being said, on a more practical note, there's a lot of overhead in terms of the time you need to dedicate to learning the method and understanding it. And when I have PhD students who are interested in this sort of stuff, it always comes with a disclaimer of like, don't put all your eggs in this basket, because it's a lot of time and energy, and it's a long time to collect data. It takes a lot of money, but it's a really great supplement to some theoretical idea, I think. And it provides a lot of validity in my eyes to see, oh, wow, the brain is actually responding in the ways that we thought it was, or it's not.
Thanks a lot, Frank. Those are great suggestions. I want to thank you for joining us here today. So for you so early in the morning, thanks for getting up. And of course, you will, once we ever get to meet each other, you will receive our Hot Politics Lab coffee mug.
That's what I'm in it for, really. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, here it comes.
All right.
Thanks a lot. Hope to see you indeed at a conference, maybe in Montreal. Everything is in Montreal this year, so then.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I actually, so I have two little ones that have eaten up a lot of my time recently, and this is my kind of the first year in a while that I'm hitting a lot of the conferences. So I hope to see you and all you guys and meet you in person. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It was fun.
Just two more things. So the schedule is as follows. Trying to delay a little bit. Oh yeah, of course. So next week we have Graduate Friday, right? Yeah. And the schedule has changed a little bit. So this time Tobias Rohrbach and Micah Holman will present their work. The week after, December 2nd, we have Kristen Schultz from ASCOR presenting on neural mechanisms of polarization and information spread, which, by the way, is part of a much larger research project that we're setting up here at the university about polarization. And for those of you interested, yes, there will be people hired on this.
In fact, there is already one vacancy out, right?
There is already one vacancy out, yes. Yeah. That's right. When is the deadline, Bert?
December 1st. So that's on polarization of young adults, 4-year project based at a pedagogical department. So we'll be panel data and classroom interventions to figure out how kids polarize and how maybe to depolarize. So it's with Remmert Daas and Anke Munnigsma at the pedagogics department, and myself and Han van den Maas, professor of psychological methods. There as well.
Yeah.
So
and so soon
apply or reach out if you have interest.
Soon there will be another position advertised that is more closely tied to the neural mechanisms part. That is also the last meeting of this year. I want to thank our sponsors, NWO, ERC, the Association for Politics and Life Sciences, and the IT department for extending our Zoom subscription. Thank you very much. And for those of you here, we'll probably have drinks in an hour or so. Frank, goodbye. See you hopefully in the future.
Yeah.